I want to kind of add here is if you look at it, I have a picture of Socrates and Jesus kind of right here on my opening slide. And this is in response to a question that was posed last time, was comparing classical thought and the gospel, especially the Gospel of John. And the question was, did Jesus study the Greeks? How was there a lot of Greek influence, in the gospel message? And the short answer of it, actually, there's a lot that can be said about that. If you're familiar with the Feast of Hanukkah, or if you've heard of it, the Festival of Lights, it happens around Christmas time every year. We have 8 days of lights. Adam Sandler wrote the Hanukkah song and did a movie called Eight Crazy Nights, which is all about that. That is about something called the Maccabean Revolt, when the Jewish authorities, they had a revolt against the Greek rule of Jerusalem. Um, and the leader, Judas Maccabees, was overthrowing Antiochus Epiphanes, who went and defiled the temple at that time. And at the core of this was, if you remember Alexander the Great, he wanted to conquer the whole world and Hellenize everybody, make everybody Greek. And so there was a whole lot of Greek influence on Judaism. And so many people spoke Greek that what we have is something called the Septuagint, is we have a Greek translation of the Bible, because people, there was so Greek speaking, they were losing the ability to speak and understand the Bible in Hebrew. And so a Greek translation of the Bible came out. One of the foremost elements of the Maccabean revolt was they were opposed to the Hellenization, to the Greekification of Judaism. And so there was actually some oppression against Greek speaking Jews. They were really trying to reinstate a lot of the ancient ways, the Jewish ways, and Hebrew speaking. So there's a lot of toughness there. Anyhow, what this all brings us to is, was Jesus aware of the Greek speaking world? Was he aware of Greek philosophy? Everybody was. And when we read the New Testament, and when we read the Gospels, when they quote the Bible, the majority of the time when they quote the Old Testament, when they say something happened in Scripture, we can see that they're quoting from the Septuagint. And so there was very strong Greek influence. And then one of the most prominent Jewish philosophers of the time was Philo of Alexandria. Again, and he was trying to incorporate Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy into Judaism in various ways. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. And that's why I have a picture of Socrates with Jesus for my opening slide there. The first thing I want to kind of bring up is we have the love command and moral religions. Is in our modern way of thinking, we have a tendency to think that religion exists to tell us what God wants us to do and exists to make us better people, and that in some sense religion makes it exist to tell us what's right and wrong. It's important to note that that wasn't true of all religions, especially in the ancient world. And when we think of Greco-Roman paganism, it was not necessarily a moral religion. The gods were frivolous; they did all kinds of things. They lots of times did not care what you did with your life. They were not really concerned about how moral you were in some sense or others. Of course, Zeus had had a realm of justice, and Zeus also was like the god of hospitality, and so there were certain customs and things that were very important. But by and large, the gods didn't really act in the same way that we understand morality to be, in modern time, the way we understand religion to function. Religious practice, sometimes people did it to curry favor from the gods. And so there was that aspect of it. The gods were certainly powerful and could control the weather and could control, certain things in your lives. And so it was important to curry favor with the gods. Another common thing was what I have listed on the slide is cosmic participation in the cycles of life. Lots of religions saw themselves as the year, the cycles of the year, the 4 seasons of the year is kind of a renewal or recapitulation of the creation epic. It's like the whole world is being recreated every year, and humanity is there participating with gods in the maintenance of the universe and maintenance of these cycles. And so human participation was a vital part of ensuring that we're going to have a good harvest, that the sun is going to come back and resurrect itself, and we won't be stuck in darkness for all of winter. And so you have this idea of the cosmos being dying and being reincarnated. And you also have this reenactment of cosmic history where they would retell the stories in the rituals of about the gods, about Kronos eating his children, and Zeus coming out and creating the order that we have now, and all of these stories. And so there was a lot going on in religions that were not necessarily all about ethics. And so our notion of a moral religion, that's kind of something that really took off during the axial age. And so we definitely see that in Judaism, certainly see that in Christianity. And if I go to the next slide, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but what we have is a whole lot of moral religions, and nearly every one of them has some form of the command to love one another. And so what I have here is, in Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, Taoism, of course, Judaism, and I'll talk quite a bit about this one. In Judaism, you have a tradition from the Talmud that says about 100 years before Jesus, Rabbi Hillel encountered a proselyte that said, Rabbi, I will convert to Judaism if you can recite to me all the commands of the Torah while standing on one foot. And so Hillel stands on one foot and he says, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole of the Torah. The rest is just details. Now go study. And so that's, already by the time that the New Testament is being written, already by the time that Jesus came about, the thought that loving one another, the command to love one another, was seen as a recapitulation, as encompassing all of the laws. All of morality was summed up in that. And if I continue, there's Jainism, Christianity, and Islam. All religions have some variation of the command to love one another. And this one, I already told you this story. This is Shabbat 31 from the Talmud. Is a first century BC anecdote. Tells the story of Rabbi Hillel standing on one foot. And what you have from this time, and we see this in the intertestamental literature, all the literature that's being written by Jewish people after the Old Testament, in that space of time before Jesus, there's this 400 years that they call like the silent years. In that period of time, there's actually a lot of writing going on, and you see this emergence of something called the double love command, which is like a combination of Deuteronomy 6, which is to love the Lord your God, and Leviticus 19, which says to love your neighbor as yourself. And all of the law and the prophets are kind of summed up in this little thing there, in these two commands. So my original MA thesis, master's thesis, was on this aspect. John 13:34. You have the series of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, which includes Judas, and then immediately afterwards he gives the command to love one another as I have loved you. And then he repeats this command again in John 15 verses 9 through 17. He says, no greater love has anyone than that he would be willing to die for his friends. And then he repeats the command to love one another as I have loved you. So we have this double love command. I mentioned that it's in all three of the synoptics. So it's repeated in every telling of the stories. Some version of this command is present. It's also in the Pauline epistles in Romans and Galatians. And we also see it in James. And in Romans and Galatians and James, they explicitly quote Leviticus 19, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. What's interesting is that in the Pauline language and in John, there are some changes that take place. The big one is, instead of saying love your neighbor as yourself, it changes to love one another. And so we see that in the Gospel of John. It says, love one another as I have loved you. And you see that loving one another in the language of Paul. And then there's a further change in Leviticus 19. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. But in the Gospel of John, it says, love one another as I have loved you. So love your neighbor has been modified to love one another. And as yourself has been modified to as I loved you. And so one of the things, if you have your pen and paper to kind of like write this down, just to kind of ask yourself is why is this significant? And what does this imply? And I will talk more about that, but that's the key thing there. And so keeping in mind, this double love command, which comes up is at the tail end of the Gospel of John. We have John's deep theology. And so now we're going to go back to the beginning of John's Gospel and just kind of look a little bit closely. We have something called the prologue, which is the first 18 verses of John's Gospel. And it begins with this phrase that many of us are very familiar with. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And in 1:14, it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so it's like, okay, Jesus is being identified as the Word, and the Greek word for that is logos, and this logos is dwelling amongst us. As it turns out, there was a whole lot of speculation. The word logos was very common in Greek philosophy, it was very common in religion, especially I mentioned earlier Philo of Alexandria, which was a Hellenistic Jew. So he's combining Greek philosophy with his Hebraic understandings. And so Philo of Alexandria discusses the logos as a mediator between God and creation. Is that God is too holy to really, come down himself. We have verses in the Bible that says, no man has seen God, where, you may not look at me and live. And so the logos is kind of this demiurge or this mediator that is able to see God and is able to come to earth, and he's able to make God known to us. The Stoics, logos was very common among Greek philosophy. The Stoics, they had a very naturalistic understanding of the universe. They may or may not have been atheists, not necessarily outright rejecting the gods, but they had their own attitude of what the universe was, and they saw the logos as universal reason. In some ways, they were pantheists. That everything, that the entire universe, including us, we're all part of that, and we're being moved by reason in some sense. We're also imbued with pneuma. There's a spirit that runs through the entire universe, including us. And so we're animated with the spirit, and we're moving towards reason. And so for them, the ideal life or the perfect life is one that's, in accord with this reason that governs the whole universe. The 10 Commandments are also referred to as the 10 words, the 10 logoi. And then there's parallels with the logos in John 1 and wisdom in Proverbs 8. In Proverbs 8, it talks about wisdom being created by God as like one of the first things that God creates, and then God consulting wisdom in the creation of the universe. And so wisdom is there as a partner to God, and wisdom has a hand in this directing God's actions in the creation, in everything. And so the entire universe is, in a way that's somewhat similar to the Stoics, the entire universe is imbued with wisdom. And so when we read John 1, we say, it says everything was created and he's upholding all things, so that this idea of how John 1 describes the logos, now Proverbs 8 describes wisdom. There's a whole lot of recognized parallel in that, especially in Jewish theology. And so what I'm getting at is when John says in the beginning, there was the logos, the word, and the word was with God. The word was God. No matter where you were, in the spectrum, whether you're a Greek philosopher, whether you're a Hellenistic Jew, or whether you're a Pharisee, no matter where you stood in all of this, that word logos, that statement is going to evoke something. It's like pulling you in there, and when you get to John 1:14, and it talks about Jesus being that. No matter what you believe, John is casting a wide net and grabbing all of these truth claims, saying whatever you think about the Logos, it is animated in Jesus. In John 1:14, what's really significant here is when it says he dwelt among us, the word used for dwelling is the same word for tabernacle. So we have this tabernacle in the wilderness. Uh, uh, the Lord commands people to construct a tabernacle, gives them instructions on how to do it. They build it to a pattern. They carry it with them, and God's presence dwells in this tabernacle. And so when Jesus is described as, when it says the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us, it literally says, and he tabernacled among us. And this statement here then suddenly depicts the Logos as the dwelling place, as the dwelling place of God. And so having the divine attributes. Excuse me as I run out real quick. And so we have this Logos as the dwelling place. And so to meet, the Logos is to meet God in the same way that the tabernacle was doing so. Forgive me. And so here we go to the next slide. And that leads us to the next step. We have John 1:17 through 18. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time, but Jesus, the monogenes, the firstborn, he has explained him. And so now we're looking at this whole, everything that's going on, and we're asking this question, in the context of what we already talked about, is looking at, John 1 and looking at the love command, is what does this mean? As I loved you imply in the context of John 1, is we have the Logos, it's coming down, it's being incarnated, it has these divine attributes, and then it says, nobody has seen God at any time, but the Logos has explained him, that Jesus is the explanation of God. And so now that leads us to the question, is like when Jesus reinterprets this command to love one another, he says, love one another as I have loved you. We're asking, it's like, what exactly does that mean? Give me 1 second. So the next thing that I have, and I only have a few more slides coming out, is Logos and mythos. This is something I ran into quite a bit in my studies, is that there's this traditional view that Logos refers to propositional knowledge, and mythos refers to like storytelling. And we kind of even use this word, we use the word myth in that sense even nowadays. When we talk about something as being false or not being true, we say it's a myth. And when we refer to Greek myths, we refer to them as stories, and we don't really think of them as capturing any kind of a truth to them. In Greek philosophical tradition, that distinction wasn't always true. And you'll see this in Aristotle's writing, especially the Poetics. When he uses the word myth, what he's really talking about is storytelling, and he uses it as a synonym for the word plot. And so the myth of a story is its plot, where it's going or what's happening. And so one of the points I'm getting at here is that myths capture truth in narrative form. And so it's a different way of communicating truth. We like to think of didactic propositional knowledge. Aristotle writes the Nicomachean Ethics. But then when Plato starts talking about what's justice and what are all these things, he does these in dialogues and stories. He tells you the story about these two people that are walking down the street towards the Piraeus. It's a 3-hour journey, and along the way are a bunch of people, and they're all just chit-chatting. And it's this story, there's this narrative that's going on. And so, here we are running through this idea that myths, carry no weight, that that these stories don't carry any real knowledge in them, that they're just chit chat and story, or that they're somehow inferior to propositional knowledge. Uh, but they're not. I would argue against that. And so here's some examples. Right here is that when Jesus, or at least the Gospel of John, talks about Jesus, they describe Jesus in story form. And so Jesus is the temple and the tabernacle. And so we're making truth claims about Jesus by applying all of these metaphors. Jesus is the manna from heaven. And so again, as we're applying the metaphor of the manna, the metaphor of the manna coming from heaven that fed the people in the desert. Jesus is the living water. There are a couple of stories that carry over from here. There's the water from the rock when Moses strikes the rock. There's the water. I'm trying to think, in Ezekiel's temple that flows out of the temple. There's numerous examples of living water. Jesus is the Passover lamb. We definitely know that from the crucifixion scene in all the Gospels. But we also have it. Jesus is the scapegoat. In the beginning of the Gospel of John, it says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. That's the scapegoat that has the blood on it that runs off into the wilderness. And so simultaneously, Jesus is both the lamb that is slain on behalf of the people, and is also the one that carries all the sins and takes those sins away. Jesus the true vine. Jesus is Jacob's ladder. That's in the very first chapter of the Gospel of John. It says, and then here on after you will see the Son of Man ascending, or the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And that's the picture that I have there, as he identifies himself as being that mediator, very similar to what Philo was saying about the Logos, is that I am that mediator that connects heaven and earth, and the angels of heaven ascend and descend on me. I'm the thing that enables this to happen. And then finally, Jesus is the Logos. And so narrative does this really cool thing where it reunites mythos and logos. We have things that are certainly being taught. This guy, G.S. Kirk, who was a comparative, did a lot of work in comparative religions. He says, before Aristotle, all those people came out, there was a lot of really complex systematic thinking, but it was just done through storytelling and done through myth. And so we can't just imagine that storytelling is incapable of communicating truth. And so narratives, especially when we get to the Gospels, are informationally dense text. There's a whole lot being communicated through these stories. And so some of the examples I gave were the Platonic dialogues, or these depictions of Jesus in the previous frame. Narrative also helps us to frame the divine as rational, and so that's what John is getting at, is by Jesus being the Logos, and Logos being understood as this rational enterprise. John is making this statement that, we're going to enter into this world of myth, and we're just kind of re-enchant the world. We're not going to just talk about everything being naturalistic. We're going to talk about a world that's infused with divine power. And I would argue, when we talk about Aristotle, and Aristotle has his, different attributes or his different virtues, and he has this problem of how do we describe the virtues, that what's taking place in this command is, because it's the centerpiece of the entire gospel, that to love one another as I have loved you, that we're doing two things. One, we're identifying love as the key virtue. And then Aristotle would argue, is how do I know what the virtues are? Well, you find somebody who's an example of it, and you follow that. And so what we have is Jesus saying, love one another, which everybody acknowledges already that that's the key thing. And his explanation is, as I have loved you. And so he's pointing back to himself as the example of what this is, what love genuinely looks like. So in the immediate context of, giving the command, when he first gives the command, love one another as I have loved you, it is right as he washed the disciples. And he actually says, Do you see what I have done? I have done this as an example to you. I am your Lord and Master, and you call me that. Good. If I, as your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, then you need to wash one another's feet. And so that's clearly going on right there in the first time he gives that command. The second time he gives the command is when he says, "Greater love is no one that he would give his life for his friends," and he is immediately foreshadowing the crucifixion. We all know that that's what's going to happen next. And so again, this self-sacrifice, the servitude for other people, as exemplified in the foot washing, and then also in the crucifixion and a willingness of self-sacrifice. Additionally, if we were to look at the different signs, Jesus' ministry and ask, is that how we're to love too? If Jesus is the example, we have healing. He heals the blind man. He heals the paralytic. We have the provision of feeding the 5,000, protection, mastery over the elements, and then also blessing and bringing water to the wine. So what is the significance? And again, I'm just going to kind of leave this for you guys to think out. When he cleanses the temple, what does that mean? What's taking place in the temple cleansing? A lot has been written on that recently. And that would be a whole lecture all by itself. So back to, where we started, and we're just kind of wrapping it up here, is what do Jesus and Socrates have in common? They asked what's going on with the Greek thought. Not a lot of people right now would point to Socrates or say that there was a whole lot of Socratic or Platonic influence necessarily in John's gospel. But there are certainly, if we were to take a look at it, we would see a lot of parallels. And the big one, this was a lecturer did bring this up to me, is everything that is written about Socrates and everything that is written about Jesus has been written posthumously, and that their deaths loom as a shadow over everything that they say or do. And so there's nothing, in all the dialogues that take place about Socrates, we know how he died. That's the big thing. And so that's at the background of it. And the same thing goes for Jesus. Everything that Jesus says and does, we know how he died. We know that the cross is his destination here. And so we're kind of informed by their deaths in everything. Significant, neither of them resist the death sentence when they're there. Both the Gospels and the Socratic dialogues highlight a contradictory testimony of their accusers. Socrates describes having a romantic love for truth, and this is one that really stuck out to me, is when Socrates is there and they give him the hemlock. They've actually bribed the guards, and he has this opportunity where he could leave and he doesn't have to die. And he discusses, his reason for walking forward, and he talks about being a lover of truth, in the same way that one has just a romantic love, loving truth so much that one might be willing to die for it, and that's really what's going on there. And we have this discussion of truth that takes place when Jesus is before Pilate. He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And then Pilate kind of looks at him, and is like, "What is truth?" So we have this discussion. Truth is significant in Socrates' dialogue, just as he's getting ready to die, and truth is a significant theme for Jesus as he's sitting there before Pilate receiving his sentence. And so there's certainly some parallels going on there. And that's all that I have. So let me go back to the forgive me, I'm having a hard time unmuting everybody. Right, Shrikant, you are the co-host.
All right.
So now you have the power.
Okay. All right. So folks, let's start. Give me just a second. So first I want kind of overall reactions to what Gary said, and then would love to hear, we have plenty of time to do discussion, but just start with kind of overall reaction. Kwan, I noticed that you have unmuted, so how about you get started?
Oh, wow. Thank you, Shrikant. It was such an honor. Well, I would like to say that it's very interesting, once again, Gary. Um, I would like to say that I would like to come back to mutos and logos precisely.
Mhm.
Because for me, mutos has always been very clearly the fact that, yes, it's a storytelling, but it's a storytelling for conveying uh, the ideals, the values, the aspirations of the role models. So, as you said, it's a storytelling for conveying truth and not facts, okay? Because the way I see it, I visualize a triangle, and I say that there's a trialectical relations between myth, awareness, and facts, okay? So you have facts like, for example, the distance between Earth and the Moon. Those things, most of the time, are not subject to debate, not serious debate. This is only a question of having more precise instruments. But the segment that is more problematic is the journey from mutos, meaning from myth, to awareness, precisely. Okay, and it's always my background that is speaking in terms of mutos precisely, because I think that when different religious traditions might have problems against each other, it's not about the truth, it's about the mythology that would convey the truth. And I always come back to your first presentation, okay? Catharsis, theoria, and theosis. Because I see it as, in my understanding, okay, because of my background, as something more dynamic than simply mimesis, okay? Mimesis, the imitation of a role model. But I always see mimesis, the imitation of a role model, as problematic because it reminds me of fake it till you make it. Maybe I'm wrong to say that, okay? But what you describe in the process of catharsis, theoria, and theosis appear to me as more of a autonomous epistemological journey to precisely the capacity to be virtuous, precisely because you make an allusion to Aristotle in your presentation, that he was struggling to find the right definition for virtue. Well, I would like to propose the following thing. I think that giving a right definition for virtue would not make you virtuous, would make you more capable to talk. But and it's not bad to be capable to talk. But when you would see someone in the street needing your help, I don't think that is the definition of virtue that would give you the inner energy and the valor to help that person, but rather the process that you have already undergone of catharsis, theoria, and theosis, precisely, that would give you that inner energy that would make you capable to do what is virtuous, or let's say shining. I stop here for now.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Gary, what I was thinking of is getting all the comments, if you could keep track of all of them, and then you can address all of them. Is that okay with you? Or would you like to go one by one? Whatever you prefer. Gary, you're on mute though. I have no idea what you're saying.
How about that?
Okay, now I can
All
hear
right.
you.
I kind of want to, yeah, I don't have any pen and paper, and so it'll be hard for me to keep track of them if I decide to do them
Oh,
afterwards.
all right, so go
And
ahead.
so
Go ahead.
just as a convenience,
Okay.
in a nutshell, first off, I really appreciate what in the back of my mind as I'm preparing this, I'm thinking of you, Quan, because you have these questions, and I also don't want to put it off. Part of what I'm doing is, and I might be reading myself into it too much, is this whole notion of theosis and even the notion of virtue ethics was very difficult for me to come to. You know, as I had a very hard time, maybe years even, just wrapping my head around it, trying to imagine, you know, if I were to, without any law, would I be able to live a virtuous life? You know, if I didn't have a bunch of laws telling me what to do, you know, would I still be a good person? And as children, I don't know if you've ever encountered this. Sometimes people say, "Is like, if there were no consequences to anything, what would you do?" You know, would you? And we create these hypotheticals. You know, imagine that, you know, we could live in this world where there would be no punishment. You know, what are the limits of what you would find accessible? You know, and I remember having these thought experiments, you know, growing up, and I always wonder about that as what's really going on in me. So the short of this is, when I talk about virtue ethics, I'm getting to theosis, to catharsis, to theoria, and to theosis. But like the bridge to get there for me is mimesis. Like on the way there, before we can really wrap our head around what theosis looks like. And I really appreciate your discussion of like the anima. What's the thing that gives us the courage to actually do it? You know, I would argue, and I'm going to fail at trying to explain it, but in a nutshell, it's the power of the Holy Spirit. That's what, you know, at least that's what the Gospel of John talks about, is, again, is appropriating some of these ideas of pneuma in other philosophies, saying that the Spirit is now here and it is animating us and it is empowering us. And it's a recollection, it's recalling back to the creation of man when, you know, Adam was just a husk of earth and the Spirit of God breathed the Spirit into him and he became a living thing. The idea of theosis is that we become born anew and we become this new creature, and we go and empowered, we get filled with the Holy Spirit. And so there's this divine anima that's animating us. How do we access that? And so that's, hopefully I'm going to hit it next week. That's the plan, is to really kind of get to it. But this whole discussion of virtue ethics, that was so profound to me, and it took me such a hard time even to get to that. That's why I've been spending so much time like discussing on this transition from deontology basically into virtue ethics as the bridge to theosis. I hope that answers some of your questions.
Gary, is it okay if I make some comments as well on as people are speaking?
Please
Okay.
do.
So, Quan, always love your comments, you know, this, because the thing is that you're coming to the same things that Gary is talking about from a very different, you know, different base. But, you know, human beings are what they are, reality is what it is. And so kind of deep thought on each, you know, multiple traditions, there is a coalescing. But at the same time, like each of the thoughts has its own kind of peculiar way of getting at things. So you're talking about catharsis, theoria, and theosis. Catharsis is all about kind of washing things away. It's kind of clearing kind of bad things out. Theoria is kind of taking in the words in order to grapple with it, grapple with the truth. And theosis is actually embodying the truth, you know, embodying the highest in yourself. And the way in which Christianity deals with it is through the person of Jesus, because he, you know, Christ on the cross is catharsis itself. It's like you have to let your old man die. So, you know, in his person, that catharsis is built in. He's the word, you know, so the theoria is built into him. And he's God and man at the same time. So he's showing you how to be a child of God. And all of this is happening all at once in his person. So mimesis, as applied, I fully agree with you, like mimesis of other people around you has all kinds of problems because you pick up their problems along with their strengths. But now when you're talking about being like Christ, kind of taking in Christ, putting on Christ, now that's different. It's like embodying the Tao. It's like being like a sage in Taoism. So it kind of that combination of kind of personification or kind of acceptance of him is a way in which this catharsis, theoria, and theosis is done all at once in Christianity. So I hope that helps. Let's go to Joe, followed by Rogine, followed by Paul. And Gary, if you want to say anything, you're always welcome to say things. Okay, great. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, just building off of what Gary had just said a moment ago, is that I thought that this was actually really interesting and key to the discussion, this idea of how you're defining virtue and you're relating it to laws, specifically. And you're talking about the transition going from laws, from this deontological perspective, to virtue ethics. So I'm kind of wondering, like, okay, so if you can't imagine virtue without laws, doesn't that imply something that's deontological in a sense? Like, how are you using the word law?
And this is, I was just listening to another podcast, a scholar named Bart Ehrman. You might be familiar with him. He's does a biblical studies academy that's all online, and he's a really prominent scholar right now. And he discusses a similar issue, is that when we were raised, on the one hand, we're being told that we're dead to the law and we're alive to the Spirit. We're alive unto Christ. There's these passages in Paul's letter to the Galatians, for example, when he talks about the law as being a pedagogue, and teaching us until Christ has come. But now that the Christ is here, we are no longer under the law. And what I'm getting at is, early on, is I couldn't understand. This was in my immaturity. I couldn't fathom how people live good lives, apart from being told to it. It seemed like law was necessary. And so most of modern Christian ethics is deontological in that sense. It's we look at, rules as being, the locus of morality is in these rules or acts. And that these rules and acts, we know what's right and what's wrong because God has commanded it in his law. And so I couldn't wrap my head around how we're dead to the law. Like, what does that even mean? And so that's what I was talking about. Virtue ethics was that bridge, which was able to, like, oh, like, now I understand, like, when he says, for the fruit of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, long suffering, self-control. And he lists all these fruits of the Spirit. I was like, and then he concludes by saying, against such things there is no law. It's like, oh, it's clear now. If I'm exemplifying these attributes, these spiritual fruits, then I don't need to live under the law. I don't need to, like, because everything I do is loving and truthful and kind and generous and whatnot. It's I'm not going to be, I don't need the law to tell me what not to do, which is mostly what the law does. I hope that kind of answers your question. As I saw virtue ethics as freeing us from the law. Suddenly it became possible for us to be good people and to have an understanding of what goodness was and to be Christ-like apart from the stipulations of the law, if that makes sense. Because that's the big thing that Paul talks about, is not being justified by the works of the law. And so it's, in that sense, I can see it as virtue ethics as being very freeing. And I think so much of when Paul talks about the Spirit, and the Word and the Christian life, it's in the framework of a virtue ethic, is what are the kinds of people that we are becoming. Timothy actually makes the point in the letter to Timothy is the law isn't for a righteous man, it's for the unrighteous. Those the lawbreakers are the ones who need laws. They need the teeth of the law telling them. That's why the sword is there, telling them not to do things. They need to be hindered from it because they're hurting other people and hurting themselves. But if we have the fruit of the Spirit, then we don't need to be under the law.
Yeah. So,
well, hopefully we don't have laws banning us from kindness. Yeah.
No, I mean, well,
Not yet.
what I'm thinking is that, not only deontological becomes dogmatic, in the sense. So then, because that's essentially, and when you were answering initially, you're using law and virtue ethics in the same tone. And that was where I got a little bit confused with that wording that you were using initially. So I think you clarified that a little bit when you're talking about how, essentially what virtue ethics is. I mean, there's an element of wisdom, and you're talking about judgment, essentially, that you're continuously forming, which actually brings me to, this other question, because I just want to make sure that I'm clarifying the terms, because I think that that's kind of key if, in order to have a fruitful discussion. When you're talking about, the distinction that's really interesting is, love one another as I have loved you, or love one another, love your neighbor as yourself, that distinction. And so taking that virtue ethics definition that you just used, and if you were to apply it to both of these statements, then what is the fundamental kind of difference? Now, I'm assuming it's a divine love that you're talking about, but given the idea of what you just defined as virtue, because what we have to do is really kind of dissect what love means, and then you can get to the distinction that you were asking about, because the distinction is in the mediation, right? That's essentially what you're saying. So then if you separate that and you take virtue ethics, then you're dissecting love, whether it's between individuals or through God. So how does virtue ethics then fit into this aspect? Because it's an important question, because a lot of times people will say, I love, but certain things are fundamental, like you can't ignore justice out of love, right? So if you're loving your neighbor as yourself and justice is part of that, are you talking about a divine justice versus a justice that is understood as wisdom? I mean, so how do you parse that out is essentially how are you making and distinguishing between those two? I mean, is it just the divinity aspect of it?
So I mean, the problem. So Aristotle described, virtue, gave at least a couple of different definitions. One that means between, two extremes, and also like those attributes that are necessary for us to live our purpose, whatever that is. Like to be fully human, to flourish. And so I think what he's doing is he's kind of solving that. It's like when Aristotle was asked, and he talked about, well, the mean between two extremes is really hard to define. He would say, well, go find somebody who's courageous. You're certainly going to find somebody who has it. And mimesis was a key element. Is like, if you want to learn courage, then you imitate courageous people. If you want to learn this, then you find people who personify it and you follow them. And so the solution being offered in the Gospels, and specifically in John, is simply by Jesus as the personification of love. And so if we want to know what love is, we're not just like randomly finding somebody and going at it, as we've gotten the picture. We have two very specific pictures. We have the foot washing and we have the cross. And the command to love one another as I have loved you is Jesus is saying, this is the example of what it means to love. And then he loves as a slave loves, and then he says it again, foreshadowing the cross, and says, we know he's talking about the cross because he says, I'm about to give my life for my friends, and he calls them friends right there. right in the context of that true vine discourse and abiding in him. And so at the very least, we have clearer pictures. Love is no longer this ambiguous thing. And if we're going to engage in a debate as to what love is, we at least have standards. We have two very clear, we have the cross, the true vine discourse, and we have the foot washing as our standards for having the discussion, that robust discussion of what is the virtue of love. And getting back to our Jewish roots is he's kind of like scrunching all of those 11 virtues that Aristotle talked about, say it's all captured in this one. That was already the tradition, was to love your neighbor as yourself, is all of the law and all of the prophets is captured under this. That's the notion of Hillel standing on one foot saying, there, that's what it all means. You know, the rest is just details, go and study. And so Jesus is really recapitulating that whole thing. But the difference is he's like, I am the example. You're going to love one another, which also expands it, because like a lot of people, there was to varying degrees of debate as to who the neighbor was.
Yeah.
You know, they were trying to argue like, my neighbor isn't everybody else. It's only this person that's living right next to me. You know, in the context, it was even the foreigner who's living in your land. You know, it says, don't be unkind to an Egyptian. You were because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt too. And so I hope that answers your question.
I mean, form, it's like kind of it's, you know, you're almost getting to the idea of cosmopolitanism in a way, right? So that there's this higher level of consciousness where you're not just loving your neighbor that's directly next to you, that you're actually caring about the, you know, the whole cosmopolis, right? So there's that element of it. And that's almost, you could say, it is the divine love, right? And then you get back to this idea of the transformation of, you know, essentially the transformation to the divine, or this idea of that man was made in the image of God, so that therefore you should love everyone as yourself. And so there's that kind of that idea that's built on that. So I think that's you know, that's an interesting kind of component, is just to kind of dissect what, you know, kind of you meant by love, and seeing it. And you're saying Christ becomes the embodied example versus what we thought, how we define love. And when I think of virtue ethics, that's that's where it's like, well, then you're just talking about the theological virtues versus then the idea of the virtues themselves. So, and so there's still some overlap there. It's just one is, you know, kind of based on divine reason versus this other form of the cardinal virtues, if you will, which are foundation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Chance for other people, and we can come back.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, because I definitely want to come back to the mythos aspect of things as well as the logos. I definitely want to make sure I get in a second chance here.
Yeah, please do. Let everybody put in. I would just say I'll just make one quick comment. You know, the way in which the epistemology works in Christianity is different, because everything is illustrated. So for example, in John 13, love is illustrated by an action of foot washing. It is illustrated by the words, and it is illustrated by the love that is felt. So everything is body, mind, and heart all together, and is presented as a person. So that's a very different way of thinking than the typical kind of intellectual way of thinking about these things. So you kind of have to get into that mode in order to understand what is being said.
Yeah, it's the theological virtues and versus, you know, the idea of the rational virtues, and then God as the mediator versus individuals mediating themselves.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Rogine, followed by Paul.
I want to lead us, as usual. I'm like thinking very pragmatically. I noticed that I hadn't before. That when you talked about the Christian love, it was love one another, not specifically saying love everyone, And as I understand it, it's not entirely clear until Christian writers clarify it, who Jesus was giving his life for specifically. And I'm thinking currently, I grew up evangelical, very much an evangelical background. And it seems to me that love, Christian love, at that time, and I'm 72, was much more kind of love everybody. And it seems to me as time has marched on, especially recently, it's more love those who are like you, who are Christian in the way you are. Did you, when you were asking what does that mean, have you thought about it that way?
That was certainly a discussion. A lot of people talk about limiting that love. Like, what does he mean? Does he just mean your neighbor in proximity? In the context, does he only mean your Israelite? This conference that I'm going to, they would argue that even when it says love your neighbor, they mean love your legally accepted immigrant and not the other person who happens to be here illegally. Yeah, and I'm not saying this, whatever this is. I just sat under, their conference, and they explained it very clearly. And he tried to parse it through the Hebrew words, talking about there's different words for sojourners, and so they're trying to like really make a distinction, looking for an excuse of who to and who not to love. It's really clear, especially when we look at the synoptic gospels. Jesus says flat out, love your enemies and forgive your enemies. And he says, if you love your friends, you're not doing anything different than anybody else in the world does. Everybody loves their friends. Everybody's kind to their own family members and whatnot. If you've really got it nailed down, you're going to love everybody, even the people who, be kind to those who pray for those who persecute you. He says that explicitly. And even in Leviticus 19, it extends, it says, love your neighbor as yourself in 1918, probably referring to the Israelite. And then in 1934, it explicitly talks about the sojourner that's in your land. And then it uses the exact same phrase and says, love your neighbor as yourself. And so it's intending to expand it beyond just the normal. And that's, going back to its old root text. And so Jesus, when he says to, be kind to those who persecute you and to pray for your enemies, really isn't saying anything new. He's reiterating what was there, what people really understood there. And so that's where I would get at. I also argued, like years and years ago when I did my first, defense for my bachelor's degree, is that love extends not just to people, but we have an obligation. The entire universe is moaning and groaning, waiting for its day of redemption. And when you look, creating us in his image and his likeness, that's where the book goes, is we're extensions of God's presence on earth, and we're extensions of God's rule. And we have this picture of this beautiful garden that's flourishing. It's already an abundant earth, and he puts us in a garden to make it even more abundant. It's a really beautiful picture. It's very different from how people treat the earth now. We really shouldn't be having, poverty and death and disease and all those things, and not to like press the point too much further. I was just thinking of, I can't remember who was Julian or Theodosius. It was one of the Roman emperors who was complaining that the Christians are out there taking care of the sick, people that aren't even Christians. And he's like, and we're not doing that. What's wrong with us? They have all of these converts because they're out there being kind. And so this love ethic was, at least in the very earliest days, it was like so vital, such a vital part of what it meant to be a Christian, especially in the pre-Constantine era. That's how Christianity grew to be such a dominant force in the Roman Empire. is they extended their love just so big, and it was poor people. It was poor illiterate folks were the earliest Christians, and they just loved each other, and Christianity grew out of love.
Just one quick comment.
As
Go ahead, Rojin.
well, as trying to practice Stoicism, I find it hard to go along with the Stoic ideas that no person does evil knowingly, that they just don't understand their situation. And Marcus Aurelius is basically see the spark of the divine in everybody. And I'm asking myself, does that go farther? Anyway, I'm not sure I'm contributing anything, but this is making me think. Thank you.
Thank you, Rojin. Just one quick comment. When you read the New Testament in the original Greek, there are many different words used for love. And this love command and everything, the kind of love that Christ is talking about is called agape, okay, which is basically this love of pouring yourself out. And that's what he's saying. Like he's saying, as I have loved you, love one another. And as he has loved you, that means it includes the cross. That's what he's saying. That's what he's holding out as a standard. And so what Gary's pointing to is that kind of love. Let's go to Paul. Paul next.
Yeah, this is a good, what you just said is everything you just said is a great launching point to what I wanted.
Thank you for your patience, Paul.
Oh, it's easy because I get to hear all these great conversations. And it helps me I always end up changing what I'm going to say 10 times because of all the great things people brought. But in this case, I'm not doing as much of that because I love how you're trying to find all the precedents and point out some things that aren't usually pointed out about what was already there when Jesus was teaching and what was his basis. And you referenced a few different things about that. But the one I want to kind of dig in a little more to and ask about, and maybe I want to make sure I present what you said accurately, but I'll get to that in a minute. So I'm going to quickly, I think maybe the best place to start is in the Odyssey when Ulysses gets back to Ithaca in disguise, right? And nobody knows he's Ulysses. And he sees all these suitors in his house trying to get to his wife Penelope. And he gets really upset. But one thing he's very upset about is their treatment of him. Because he says later to them, once he's come out, or not quite before he's revealed himself, he says, if I was running a household and a stranger staggered in off the ocean or the sea and came to my door, I would never treat him as horribly. I would offer him wine. I would sell him, he could stay as long as he wanted. Now, why am I telling that story? Because now, flash forward to Ephesus, where I told you I think I just was, which is so great about this. And imagine Paul in a debate with the people who believe in the mythology of the time. Not actually Socrates, but the people who really bought the whole thing about the Greek gods, because that was part of their daily life. They were going to temple. It was deep devotion for them. And I think instead of sort of writing it all off as some guy was trying to sell more silver statuettes, I want to go one level deeper when they were debating him and say, look, the guy might say to Paul, and this is what I'm asking you, Gary, are you calling our faith with the Greek gods amoral and having no ethics? Are you crazy? Just because the gods did wrong things does not mean that we don't use every single one of those stories to tell the right thing. There's a very deep underlying ethic. Love your neighbor? Well, yeah, but also do kindness and charity to your neighbor. deep in our tradition. Are you going to deny that, Paul? So I don't know if you, if I think you kind of said, Gary, oh, the great gods were amoral and, ethics wasn't part of that. And that, so that's what I'm talking about. And that's about how, I think I made my point.
I think what I was really trying to get, thank you so much for that question. Like they certainly had ethics, they certainly had laws, they had a rule of law. And that's not just Greek society, that's all societies. And the reason why I bring this up or even talk about it like this is because, especially being raised in a conservative evangelical home, they would teach us that, without God, there is no ethics and there is no morality. And so that's really kind of like almost the opposite point that I'm trying to make, is that Greek religion didn't have necessarily a really strong moral basis in the sense that Judeo-Christian ethics are, but that doesn't mean that the people didn't have ethics or that everybody was just profligate. And that's really kind of a mistruth that is taught to early to Christians, especially growing up, is that apart from the Christianity that's in our society, and saying things like America is a Christian nation, if it wasn't for that, we would all be a bunch of mindless savages. And so I guess part of what I'm trying to get at is that morality existed even in the absence of a quote unquote moral religion. The Greeks certainly had morality, and they certainly talked about it. But on the flip side, Plato's dialogue Euthyphro is specifically addressing that question. He asks flat out, is it good because the gods say it's good, or do the gods say it's good because it is good? And in the dialogue with Euthyphro, Socrates brings up, this god says to do this god does this. There's a lot of back and forth on it. So which one do I believe? And so that question that you're posing right now is the specific question that Plato brings up. Like what is the basis for our ethical understanding? And part of what he's getting out to is that we seem to have an inherent, maybe natural law would be a good way to describe it, is we all seem to understand that justice is a thing, and that we're striving for it. And so you'll see so many of Plato's dialogues and so much of Aristotle's discussion is about, like, what are these virtues? We know that we have them. We operate as if they're real things. Can they be defined? How are they defined? And we see these as instrumental to living the good life, to live the eudaimonic life, to be the best human that I am, involves in somehow according with those virtues. And I guess what I'm getting at least with the Gospel of John and here, is that there's a preeminence for love. And it's not just randomly only in the Gospel of John. It's in every single of the Gospels. It's in the writings of Paul. It's in the writings of James. We see it, reiterated here in the Gospel of John. And it was already part of the Jewish, thought world, at the time with Hillel, which has been recorded now in the Talmud. It's seen as the pivotal question, is loving one another really is what captures all of the law. That's like the cardinal virtue from a Jewish perspective. So that's really what I'm getting at. Is that seems to be the crux of it from a Judeo-Christian perspective. And before we get to theosis, the bridge to theosis is mimesis. Is maybe even if we're not feeling God or have made the profession of faith or something like that, we can see the example of Jesus and we can see the foot washing, we see the cross, and people, Christian or no Christian, people generally have a lot of respect for that. And that's really what he says when he gives the command. He says, by this others will know that you're my disciple, that you love one another. And so it's not just this is what you should do, is we declare the gospel and proclaim Jesus' presence in the world through our acts of love. And so theosis becomes real. Like, people see God when we love one another. It's God is revealed in a meaningful way. And that's where I'm getting back to, like, the whole Imago Dei, Genesis 1, we're created in the likeness and image of God. If that likeness and image is most manifest in love, then we're revealing God's presence, we're revealing God's nature in ourselves through acts of love. I hope I kind of answered your question. I was really trying hard not to be political and scoot it.
No, we don't want to be political. Can I respond very briefly, Srikant? Okay. I love that you brought up the Plato dialogues, because I was going to mention Socrates. Getting to what Kwan said about, it's all about, you've got these myths, and then what's the best group of myths to capture actual truth? But you could look at that dialogue of Plato as really setting up a straw man and ripping the poor guy to shreds with an intellectual, down this path we will go. But if you could define, you could talk about ways of responding to Socrates' questions that were different, that used the myths differently, and a deeply educated person in those myths could put a counter argument out that they're not just arbitrarily doing what the gods say. We know which myths were telling positive lessons and which were not. And Plato misrepresented, and actually Socrates really wanted a philosopher's citizen. But Plato decided to rewrite everything for the philosopher king, and he put words in Socrates' mouth. I'm just giving your own smart point that these were written later. We're looking later on something later. So there's a way of positioning that set of myths, like any set of myths, including the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, as a bunch of screwed up things that lead to bad conclusions, or if you use them a different way, they're getting at the same underlying truth. I'm just being a little bit of a devil's advocate for that frame of mind. I do not go out and worship Apollo every morning, but thank you. That's all I have to say.
I'm going to just add one tiny little bit of irony, which is that we're reading, talking about Euthyphro. It is a dialogue, right? It is in itself, by definition, a myth. And so it's the funny, that's really what I'm getting at, is that it's a storytelling. And especially with all of these, we're back to the whole thing is Socrates' death is a dark shadow that looms over every one of those dialogues. Is you can't read the dialogue. There's allusions to his death, in it. Lots of times the characters in the Platonic dialogues are people who have died, and so when you're reading this conversation, that person died in such and such battle. The place where they're going to was captured, by the Spartans in such and such war. This person becomes one of the 30 tyrants that rules Athens, and they're all engaged in this dialogue, and those things that's the power of myth, or the power of story, is that it's dense, informationally dense. Plato can just say, and then Glaucon said, and we've now everything that we know about Glaucon is suddenly born to the front here in his words. And so he's using myth to communicate in very deep ways. And that's what's really going on with Jesus. He could say, love one another as I have loved you. And the power of the command is in the story, because he does that right as he's washing everybody's feet, and he's washing Judas's feet. And after he washes everybody's feet, he gives Judas the communion bread and tells him, yes, you're going to go out and betray me now. And he goes out, and it was night. And so there's the power of the myth, the power of the story. And again, I'm not using myth as like, it's a made up story. We're talking about the story and the truth that is communicated through it.
Thank you.
But thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And your point is really well made, because when we studied Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, and Gospel of John, like so many commonalities come. There is a lot of commonalities, and then each of them have their own specialties. So, and what I find is that people who are kind of deeply immersed in even one of them actually can see like precursors of it, analogs of it in across multiple things. So there is that. So because it's like God so loved the world, so it's not that only a certain group of people have it. It's all spread across earth, and it has been spread over time. So you will expect to find good things all over the place. What I want to do is I want to make sure that Gary gets good feedback on his book because he's writing a book. Would love to hear thoughts of as many people. So Jeannie or Junie, would you like to share your thoughts? Whatever, not right now, Jeannie. What about Jeannie? Anybody else, if you'd like to share, DLJ? Jeannie is trying to unmute, so we'll go with Jeannie first and then DLJ. Jeannie, what are you? Okay. All right, Jeannie, I don't know what's going on with Jeannie. Jeannie, if you can unmute, we can do it. Otherwise, let's go to DLJ. DLJ, go ahead.
All right. Thanks for the presentation. I missed last week, so I'm not actually sure where we're at. Are you in chapter 1 at the moment or still doing bits of the introduction? You need to unmute. I can't lip read.
I'm basically just kind of like getting a precursor to theosis. We're going to talk
okay.
about the main point theosis, and so I wanted to discuss virtue ethics, getting into that.
Got it. So this is the
thematically, yeah.
Right. So this is a justification for the method you're using.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I got it. All right. So that's my point 4, I think it was, from 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, whatever it was. Could I have your, because this is book critique, right? I mean, Shukran just asked for that. What's your 50-word description? I'm doing marketing stuff. What's your 50-word description for the objective of your book?
Thank
and
you.
that's your homework. Because if you can't do it now, it's all right. Because I had a boss that kept doing that. What are you trying to do? Break it down. Less words, fewer words. Put it on what's it going to say on the website? 50 words or fewer, right? It's not an easy exercise, but
Yeah.
I just having a go at that because it's really going to focus the structure and everything, right? Because what I'm hearing from what I,
Gary,
just a little bit, right? But because what I'm getting coming across from what I just heard is that your target audience is Christians who are behaving badly. You want to, yes, and it's not like that changing the whole world. It's, I think, US Christians who are not doing what Jesus would have done, right? And that's your target audience, I think. So you're saying use mimesis, right? Go on.
And I'm sorry you weren't here last week because I actually had a section where I talked about the target audience specifically in response to your input.
Oh, thanks.
And there was a sense that it's like casting a wide net. The primary target, like I'm getting ready to go to a conference, and part of what I'm trying to do is figure out how do I communicate this in a way that they could receive. There's a part of me that I can't like pull punches, and shirk on the truth. But at the same time, is I need to be as respectful to people that I disagree with, so that they'll be open to dialogue. At the core, the 50-word crunch. It's not going to sound very eloquent. Is Christians since the beginning have known that to be a Christian means to look like Jesus. That to look like Jesus.
So is Christians your target audience, right? You're not going for atheists.
Yeah.
They're not going to respond to the
here's
moral
the deal: is if my target audience is Christians, it's definitely Christians that are behaving badly in whatever respect, but it's also people who there's so many dialogues about Christianity and people claiming what Jesus ought to be that this is kind of trying to intuitively talk about love as we all kind of understand what it is, and so it's to give hope to the ones that aren't behaving badly, the people who are really looking, and then to the final degree is to atheists or people outside the Christian community. It's a picture of Jesus, because generally speaking, when people see Jesus, they kind of admire him. They don't necessarily like the way he's portrayed by religion, but when we see, Jesus washing the disciples' feet, when we see the self-sacrifice of the cross, generally speaking, most people can see that as like, that's kind of an admirable thing. This is a guy who did the right deal. And so there is kind of, yeah.
Right. So for that would be me, the target audience. So for me, the symbolism is irrelevant, but the message, yes. So you've spent a lot of time today on talking about the symbolism, and that doesn't hit my audience. But I mean, the message does. So that's cool. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, did I cut you off? Did you have anything more to say? No,
it's all right. So I've got. Yeah, so where does this fit in the whole structure of the book? Is this the beginning? This is set up to say this is why I'm using this method. Yeah.
Well, I was going to go kind of in order, and Shrikant kind of coached me into, let's start with the main point. And I don't think that I could just talk about theosis and empower, manifesting the essence of God, just like as a lecture that people would understand, or that would make any sense, for most people. So I'm using virtue ethics to bridge us into that, and so that was my own Christian experience, was beginning with.
Shrikant is right. Don't bury the lead, is essentially what you're saying. Yeah, quite right.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
okay, so you're preparing for a presentation now, as opposed to the book as a whole, or both, right?
I'm not presenting. I'm attending a presentation, or I'm attending a conference, and I'll be in dialogue with a lot of these people. I don't know if you're aware, if you know any of the big names in politics in the United States, but like Charlie Kirk, Eric Metaxas, they'll all be there, and so Lucas Miles. Evidently, you do know some of them. So anyhow, the point is, I'll be at one of their conferences, and I want to know how to have a meaningful dialogue with them, and I also want to make certain I understand them.
You won't have a meaningful dialogue with Charlie Kirk. He's got an agenda. He's going to override. He's going to roller coaster.
By golly, I'll try.
Well, okay. He's not there for a meaningful dialogue. He's there to be proven right. Yeah. But thank you.
All right. Okay, if there is nobody else, okay, Jeannie, you have raised your hand. Go ahead.
Okay, I was able to unmute, and
Yes.
my background is totally by accident, but I am wearing these crystals here, and just in case they can help me channel the love of God into myself. And part of the love of God, I think, is, you wake up and you breathe in and everything's here for us. I mean, what a perfect, nice thing we've got, and it's all provided, and, we should be very happy. And if I like to look at birds, I mean, by default, they're happy. I mean, they get upset, but, bingo, they're right back to being happy after about a second. And we really should be more like, the other things. And if we channel that into ourselves, I think, that can help. I mean, we sort of seem burdened down by a lot of things that maybe we shouldn't be worrying about so much. But I also like, the use of the idea dialogue.
Jeannie, let me interrupt you for a second. There was a cameo appearance of somebody. Can we have the cameo?
He just stepped out. That was Aman, and he waved, and he said,
I know. It was Aman. Wow.
Okay.
You at Aman's place, or is he at your place?
I'm so sorry to interrupt, Jeannie. We're on vacation right now, and so we both left town together and met with a bunch of friends, and so they're out. I'm going to join the party in a few minutes.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Actually, I can't see that because, I actually see double pictures of myself. But once I'm done with speaking, I'll try to, get back to the others. I don't want to start moving around too much on the screen. But the other interesting thing was the idea of dialogue, and that this is a work in progress to try to be more loving. And it's not something you just, instantly. And I actually, the fake it till you make it idea, I think, is very attractive, because by doing the actions, you can actually affect your mind and heart to feel the rest of it, I do believe. And just as a final thing, I'd like to say that, we need to, try to express it in action, and to keep trying. I mean, it's not something you just get automatically. And I also wanted to maybe perhaps ask you, Gary, what you think of this idea. It was popular with, kids. I mean, a parent loves their kids, but, that doesn't mean they let them do everything they want to do, or, coddles them or anything like that. Love can sometimes be in the form of tough love. And if you love somebody and they're doing wrong either to you or to others, you know, perhaps the kind of love that you express to them has to be more of a tough love. So I was just wondering what you think about that, Gary.
That one, I'll try my best. Aristotle actually talks about it like he uses the analogy of anger. And he says anybody can be angry, that is easy. But to be angry in the right way, at the right time, for the right purpose, you know, and to do it right, that is not easy. You know, and that's back to his you know, means between it. Coming from a psychiatric background, you know, and working in psych, I saw a lot of violence that was justified as tough love. And I would say that I saw a lot of people calling it tough love, you know, after the fact. I would almost say, you know, we should by default err on the side of compassion. And a resounding and recurring theme that came from our patients was parents that had been hard on them. And, you know, when they asked parents, you know, why were you so hard? Why did we do this? They're like, oh, because I wanted you to be successful. You know, I wanted you, you know, to know that the world is a cruel place, and I wanted you to be tough enough to be able to do it. And all of those things were motivated by love, but the one thing they failed to communicate was love. They communicated all these other things, and everything that they did was motivated by love, but that was the one thing they failed to communicate. The child just never grew up feeling love. You know, after the fact, as an adult, they could wrap it around their head that, you know, mom and dad were tough on me because they loved me. And so communicating love in a way that looks like love, I think that's what Jesus is saying. He says, by this, all will know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. You know, it's whatever. So I'm not totally against the idea of tough love, but it should be revealed as love. You know, and you know, so that's my take on that. And again, that's where Jesus is giving us, you know, giving us these analogies. That's why we have the foot washing, and that's why we have the cross. You know, and in that context, you know, first century, you know, Christianity, Roman Empire, those were very meaningful. Foot washing was something that, you know, you walk into somebody's house, it's expected. You know, if they respect you and you're a guest in their house, they're going to make certain somebody is washing your feet. You know, it's something that's done. It's an act of hospitality, and so some of those analogies might be lost to us now, but they were definitely very clear at the time.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Kwan. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, interestingly enough, I think that, you know, just that tough love comment, I've always thought about tough love in the sense that it's got to hurt you more than it hurts the other person. It's as simple as that. That's what's tough. It's the fact that you have to do something and it bothers you, not them. So, you know, that's that. And then otherwise, if it's just hurting them, even then this idea, well, I wanted to prepare you for the world. Then as you said very nicely, is that it meant you don't communicate love. And Thomas Aquinas actually puts it beautifully when he was talking about agape love, as Srikant was a moment ago, to will the good of another. And so that's, you know, that's how it's described by Aquinas. So I think that that's beautiful. Anyway, coming back to it, but I think that it's interesting is, you know, what your exchange with DLJ was kind of clarifying for me as to, all right, you're walking in, you're trying to communicate and to individuals that may even have different perspectives on Christianity itself, right? And maybe I'll bring that back to the idea of mythos for that. Because I think that this is one area that is, you know, it's interesting, and you can kind of start to build bridges to a certain degree. You know, so one time, and I think it's really kind of where you can see the how mythos reveals truth. Now, Paul had talked about it, how it's revealed in Greek plays. We can talk about, you know, things like Sophocles or Oedipus Rex, or, you know, any of the Greek tragedies, because the tragedies are telling us something about the truth about the world. But you're doing it from the biblical sense, in the biblical sense. And what I would, you know, kind of start with, if you're trying to communicate to them, is how that these truths are revealed through these biblical stories, because that's a starting point of like kind of where you're both agreeing to something. So example, and I don't think that this is necessarily always captured by the modern mind. So for example, the idea of the prodigal son, you know, I one time I used it as an example, and immediately people came back and said, that's a dysfunctional family. And they started to analyze the family dynamic, right? And one, I mean, even logically, you don't know what happened afterwards. He had a party one night, but then who the hell knows what after? He may have been really working his ass off for the rest of his life. But nonetheless, coming back to it, you know, and this is the power of myth and truth, is, and I brought this up last night, is that the older son that comes back from the field and is upset about his you know, brother and his father celebrating his brother's return after he had squandered, you know, his half of his father's inheritance. And so you know, basically the son is, you know, angry, obviously, and we all know the story, that essentially that you know, the father's like, your son was dead and now he's alive, and now he's coming back. And so the idea of that, what that truth obviously reveals, is something that is what is truly good, what is virtuous. It's, you know, and I said this last night, it's doing the act in and of itself. It's not doing it for the reward. Like he was begrudging his father being happy that his son wasn't dead. You know, there's this element of envy and jealousy that starts to be revealed. And this is the power of mythos culture. It's revealing a truth that, you know, essentially you should do something for the right reasons and not necessarily always look for the reward. Bhagavad Gita does this very well with the idea of the fruit, wanting the fruit, you know. So if you're talking to people, that starts to have a sense of kind of universality, that you can communicate these truths. And then you start from there to talk about virtue ethics. Because I think that that's where you can kind of bridge that gap, if that's what you're really trying to do. And mythos culture does allow to communicate to people in a way that resonates across all different Christian cultures. So I think that that's, you know, that's a very powerful way, and maybe even kind of then you could even relate it to you know, just how mythos, what it reveals in Greek culture and what it reveals in the biblical sense, and then you're cutting away.
And so I might, when I was writing the thesis originally, the issue and the reason why I brought up this logos mythos thing is people would say that the Gospel of John is not ethical at all, has no ethical value, because it doesn't have a whole list of commands. It doesn't list, you know, it doesn't have a whole bunch of didactic instruction like Jesus has on the Sermon on the Mount.
Well, really quickly.
And so, yeah.
If I may, because this is actually the important point that I was trying to get to last time. It's not about commands, it's about truth that's being revealed. So it's the fundamental truth that, you know, and getting away from commands is like getting away from the laws. So that's what I was kind of going for. If you really want to talk about what virtue is, it's conceptual and principled. It's not necessarily about a fundamental law or rule.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, so yeah, that's what I was getting at, is that there seems to be, at least in the mind that I had growing up, in the schools that I attended, Christian schools, in the churches that I attended, in the Christian culture. I brought up, Bart Ehrman, where he talks about his own experience. In the churches now, when they talk about ethics, it's captured in these commands. And when you say what's right or what's wrong, they're going to look for laws, and they look for didactic instruction and whatnot. And so the big poo-poo that people had with the Gospel of John is that it doesn't have a whole lot of commands in the didactic instruction in the same way that the rest of Aristotle or anything else does. What it has are stories. And most of those stories are about Jesus himself. And so the reason why I got into, and I agree with you, is the difference between logos and mythos is that both of them are truth telling, and mythos tells those same truths, in very, through storytelling, in very fleshed out and elaborate ways, and in some ways better than didactic instruction, because they are pregnant with data. Like I mentioned, when they're walking along the Piraeus, and Plato just mentions offhand these different people, all of these stories, like he's just giving a nod to it. But anybody who knows who Glaucon is, anybody who knows who these people are, if you know what the Piraeus is, all this data is now flushing into you and is informing the dialogue that's taking place. And so again, when we get the command, love one another as I have loved you, that was already well known, and we all knew Leviticus 19:18. We all knew love the Lord your God, Deuteronomy 6:4. And so the ritual of foot washing, all of these things that are happening right here in this story, are important, and they're imbuing this command with a whole lot of flavor, with a whole lot of data, more than the Sermon on the Mount maybe could even do it. It's really intense. And that's the only reason why I was getting into the ideas, is to really kind of highlight the power of narrative, that we can talk about ethics in the right way of doing things without a list of commands telling you to, because that's what we talked about last week, is that laws are designed to have loopholes. We'll find a way around it. If we want to break a law, we'll find a loophole, and then we'll swear up and down that we followed the law and that we're doing the right thing, even though we're doing the exact opposite. That's just the way laws work. Anyhow.
Thank you, Gary. Sorry to interrupt you the first time.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. And thank you, Joe. Next up is Kwan, and then I'm going to ask Gary a question that he asked everybody. Kwan.
Okay,
Thank you for your patience, Kwan.
Oh, not at all. It was a pleasure to listen to all those people. So I have the same answer that Paul an hour ago. I would like to reintroduce the notions of mythos and logos, but this time, because listening to all those people, I rearranged my thinking, my thoughts, and I'm someone who think a lot in terms of configuration and of images. So I was thinking of the triangle maybe an hour ago, but now I see it more like a lozenge, or a lozenge is something is a square that is nicer. So I say a lozenge. So I would say at each corner of the lozenge, I would put the mythos, the logos, the mimesis, but also the politics, Because I would like to quote George Carlin, and I think that this guy is a philosopher with a sense of humor, and not a comedian. George Carlin said that religion is like a pair of shoes. Try to find a pair that fits you, but don't make me wear your pair of shoes, right? So, and here it's about politics, because we are all born in a certain society, and in that society you have a moral code you have that is enforced politically, and it can be enforced by the law, of course. And to a certain extent, most of us are under that law, but that law is not from the inner heart, but it has been imposed from the outside and put in our mind, okay, through what I would call instructions, okay, because I make the opposition between instruction opposite for me to education. Instructions are stuff that are put in your mind by people in authority. Education, educare, means to bring forth what is from within. Okay? And to bring forth what is from within is precisely to find the pair of shoes that would fit you. Okay? But that pair of shoes that would fit you wouldn't be found by you within a certain political framework. Okay? Because I'm sure that it's the experience of all of us. We knew people who were born in a certain family with a religion that is the perfect pair of shoes for that person. Okay. If I may give myself as an example, I was born in a Confucianist and Buddhist family. Luckily, that kind of religion fit me. Okay, it could not. It could be the opposite. Okay. So here, the political framework was okay for me to give me a mimetic framework. Okay, so I could go further into the transition from mythos to logos, right? Because mythos is precisely mythos is something that would touch your heart, that would touch your emotions. Okay, Gary, you said that mythos, it's myths, it's easy, it can be remembered easier than the more intellectual explanation and so on, because it touches your heart. And once that mythos, that myths touches your heart, it's much easier for you to go to the higher awareness consciousness level, which is more the logos. Okay, I use logos here not as logical propositions, but more the divine awareness, okay, with a capital L. So, and that precisely that square combining politics, mimesis, logos, and mutos would be the integration, because the mutos would touch your heart, the logos or the theosis would really bring you to the center of awareness, and then the politics would not be something that has been imposed on your mind, but would be your free action because you are aware. And it goes back precisely to the FT okay? Is it good because God loves it, or God loves it because is it good? Well, when we start with politics and mimesis, we learn that it is good because God loves it. But when we manage or we finish our epistemological journey and would have the inner awareness to do what is right, well, we in the other side, okay, God loves it because it's good. I stop here for now.
When I first took Greek, my instructor made the same point. He says, none of us are Greek speakers. And so when we read the Greek grammar, it's prescriptive for us. But Greek children don't need Greek grammars. This thing is describing what they do naturally. And so for a native Greek speaker, this grammar is descriptive. And so they're on the other side of that same thing. You know, so what's the value of the Greek grammar? You know, and so in my thesis also, I kind of made the same way, is that, you know, I discuss morality as moral progress. When we're very young, you know, and all of these things are unclear to us, and we're just learning, you know, for just like you said, we might need to know, be told this and this and this, and then over time it becomes internalized, you know, and then we understand it from that different angle. We love it because it's good, you know, is that idea. At least, you know, that's where I'm coming from. No, I really appreciate your feedback on it. I keep, like I said, I keep thinking of you when I create these lectures, because I want to make certain that I'm meeting your expectation, because you have such good questions.
Wonderful. So Gary, let's wrap up. What do you have? Do you want to give a preview of what you're going to do next time?
So next time, bridging off of this, of what we just went through, and kind of understanding the idea of virtue ethics, I wanted to get into theosis, and then I wanted to look at it from at least 4 different perspectives: the traditional Eastern Orthodox perspective, theosis as axis mundi, theosis as mission, what we're supposed to communicate to the world, and then theosis, corporate, ecclesiotheosis, theosis in the church or in the community of what that looks like. Yeah, and that's where we're going.
Wonderful.
Hopefully.
Thank you so much.
If I could add one little thing,
Please.
it was something that I believe Rogine discussed, the idea of sin being ignorance. And that's certainly, you see this discussion of Platonic thought. It's in the Socratic dialogues, and that was a common theme in a lot of the Greek philosophy, is that we don't really sin, we're just ignorant of the truth. The Gospel of John seems to be capturing that, at least to some degree, as he talks about faith, and he equates faith with unbelief, or sin as unbelief, a lack of faith. And so there might be some intentional playing on this notion of sin as just ignorance, and that when we're acting ignorantly, that's when we're sinning. That the revelatory nature of Jesus Christ, who he is, having faith in Jesus, is what enables us, and that our falling away or our lack of belief, lack of belief in the person and work of Jesus is what leads to sin. But there is some indication of that.
Wonderful. All right, folks. So thank you so much for being here. Really great comments. And thank you very much, Gary. Look forward to next Thursday. Take care, folks. Bye.
Good night.